Hi, my name's Serafina and you're watching my channel Fina Makes. Today I'm going to show you a quick tutorial on how to create a button stand for the centre front of any pattern or block that goes straight across with no opening. Let's get started. So I'm starting with a bodice block. I want to add a centre front button stand down here. This also works for the centre back. So once you've decided, you've got your pattern, you can trace it off if you want to make sure that you keep the original, and then you are ready to add your button stand. So that I can zoom in and show you a bit of detail, I'm going to turn this to the side and I'll see you in a sec. This is my block, it has no seam allowances. If you're using a pattern, just make sure, you don't need to worry about any of the side seams or the armhole or anything, just make sure that your centre front or centre back, wherever you're putting your button stand, doesn't have seam allowance on it. So if the original pattern had a seam at the centre back or centre front, make sure you take the seam allowance off, because otherwise you're going to make your garment too big. So I've got my centre front line and now I'm going to add my button stand onto it. So I'm going to do a grown on button stand. I'll also show you how to do a separate button stand. So this represents the centre of my garment. I want to add enough that travels over from the centre line so that I can underlap the piece and then have two pieces that cross over with the centre front line going down the middle. So the average amount for a button stand at the centre front of a garment is 3 centimetres, which is just over an inch. It's about 1.25 inches. The reason for that is, particularly on women's wear, boobs generally happen here. So if you go too far over, you'll end up with a lot of overlap, plus the curve of the neck is quite extreme at that section. So you don't want to travel too much that way if you've got a curved neck here. The exception to that rule would be if you were doing a double-breasted item. If that was the case, then you would make a wider neck to allow for the extra overlap. For this one, I'm doing a regular button stand. The average is 3 centimetres, 2.5, 3 centimetres, around 1 inch or 1.25 inches. So I'm going to use that here. So what I want to do is take half that amount and draw a line outside of my centre front line. I like to use 3 centimetres wherever I can because it's easy maths on the patternmaster. So I'm lining up my third line with my centre front line. So the third line on my patternmaster, and that's going to give me an extra 1.5 centimetres. Draw that line in. So that's going to be the edge of my front. And then what I want to do is mark a line 1.5 centimetres inside of my centre front. So if you're doing a grown on button stand, so if you want the whole piece to be in one and you're just going to put buttons on there, don't draw this next line. If you want to do a separate button stand, you draw this next line and then you extract the pattern piece. So to draw the inside line, not only am I doing 1.5 from my centre front inwards, I'm also making sure that my line back here agrees as well. So I'm only adding a total of 3. That's really important because if you keep drawing lines based on just the previous line, you can end up adding more than you intend. So that's my 3 centimetres. This is where my buttons and buttonhole are going to be based. This is the edge of my garment. And then if you're going to do a separate button stand, this will be a seam line. If you're doing a grown on all the way to the edge, just ignore that line and don't draw it. Next, we want to true up some edges. So for the bottom, I'm just going to do a right angle. That's nice and simple. For the top, what I want to do is fold this line back. So if you're having a separate button stand, you trace this off and add seam allowance, and you trace this off and add seam allowance on this line here. So I'll show you what that looks like now. I find it easier to do a rectangle and then match up to the pattern. So lining up underneath, you can copy the bottom, copy the top. It's a good idea to do a notch, and then you know which bits match up. So with the separate button stand, you can then add seam allowance to here and ignore that. So put a centimetre along that edge, cut this out, and you're done. With the button stand, you can either add a centimetre all the way around and cut 2. So for each side, you'll cut a pair. Or if you wanted it to be a grown on, so if you wanted this to be on the fold, simply fold the paper make sure you've got enough paper behind to cover the whole shape. And then as you work, add seam allowance, seam allowance, seam allowance, and then cut that out and it's ready. If you want to do a grown on button stand, this is the edge of your garment. So you would either do a facing, or the easiest way is to add extra here. And then what you want to do is fold this edge. Then tracing wheel this shape here, and tracing wheel this shape here. When you open this out, you have got the shape that you need to make your fold back button stand. The last thing to do is to add buttonholes. How do you know where to put them? What I usually do is, this is my true bust point here. I always add a button at the bust point first. Nobody likes gaping. So that is where you put your middle button. If you have the buttons, you can get them. I think I've got a few too many. And then you could place them on the pattern. So if you want one there, maybe I want to have 2 here. You could also place one nearest the top. So you want one about no more than 2 centimetres down from the top edge, really. The bigger the button, the further down you can go. So we'll pop that one there, and then you can see how to space them. So the average amount to space the buttons is about 7 or 8 centimetres at this kind of average shirt size, which is about 3 inches. So I use my patternmaster, I pop it against my centre front, I line the centre up with my bust button, and then you can figure it out. If you like doing maths, you can add them up, but just make sure that each one is at the same location. So as a bare minimum, I could do 8 centimetres, 8, 16, and then we've got 8, and then 16 this side. So I quite like that. Decide where you want the bottom one. I mean, this is to the waist, so I probably want one nearish the bottom, so I'm happy with that placement. Once you've decided where to put your buttons, you can then mark the placements on. So we've got 8, 16, and 8, and 16. And the beauty of doing it this way is that that's your 0, so you just need to make this and this the same as that and that. Done. So how was that? Hopefully I have demystified the art of adding a button stand to the centre front. You could also try adding the stand to the back of a garment, and it also works on skirts and trousers too. Let me know how you get on in the comments below. If you like this tutorial, hit the like button. If you want to see more from me, subscribe, and head over and follow me on Instagram too, @fina.makes. See you soon.